All right, so the next dynasty that we're going to talk about started out as what we call the Mongol Empire. Now, one of the things that I want to note is that if you look at the dates there, you'll see that 1100 CE, approximately around that time period, is when we're going to talk about the beginning of kind of the Mongol Empire. Now, we're going to see some crossover here while the Song dynasty is still in power. So if you look at your map down there, you'll notice the Song dynasty is still ruling that part of China. However, up near the top, you can see in that region what we see happening is a lot of small tribes that are fighting for control in the northern part of Asia. And one of those tribes was the Mongols. And the Mongols were this nomadic or constantly moving pastoral group from the region that we would call the Gobi Desert. And so within this region, they were moving around. They were oftentimes kind of like animal herders by nature. And the Mongols had a reputation for being very violent and chaotic and were constantly fighting with many of the other tribes in that region. Now, through this violence and this warfare, in 1178, we see a young warrior start to emerge and gain followers. His name was Temujin, and Temujin really takes on this role as a leader within their tribe, the Mongols. Kind of some interesting backstory is Temujin was a witness to terrible violence within his own family. With all of this violence and bloodshed amongst these tribes, he actually witnessed his mother and his brother be pretty much executed right in front of him, and he was unable to stop that event. So it left him very kind of hardened and wanting to kind of further the Mongols and fight back against many of these other kind of unruly tribes at this time. And so Temujin decided that he was going to start to use some different tactics that would allow for him to kind of bring these tribes together and unite them. And as he did this, he became more and more powerful and would eventually become known as Genghis Khan. And Genghis Khan translates roughly to the phrase universal ruler, meaning that basically the ruler of everything. And that is going to be relatively true about Genghis Khan, and he is going to build this huge empire of the Mongol Empire and rule pretty much all of Asia within his lifetime and within a very short period of time. So let's talk about how he was able to do that. One of the interesting things that he started to do was to unite these people all under him as kind of the central ruler. Is he started to kind of approach these other tribes and try and form alliances with them and bring them into the Mongols. If that didn't work, then what he would do is oftentimes execute the leaders of those neighboring enemy tribes. And so this would send a very powerful message that he wasn't going to let any other powers try and usurp him or take control over the Mongols, kind of establishing his dominance and him being kind of the alpha of the Mongols. And he also was able to organize a very, very powerful military. So the military strength of the Mongol Empire was one that very few, even today, are able to discredit as being one of the most powerful militaries and forces to be reckoned with in all of history. And so initially under Genghis Khan's rule, he's able to conquer all of these surrounding tribes and unify the land that is today modern day Mongolia, the country that is right above China. And obviously Mongolia gets its name from the Mongol Empire dating all this time ago. So we can start to see some of the foundations for the political geography and groupings today. So let's continue talking about kind of the practices and tactics that the Mongols were most famous for, because that's really what they're known for in history. So they practiced some very, what we would consider, brutal policies. So some of the things that they did that they're famous for, they did not play very fairly with others because they were well known for what they called false withdrawals. What they would oftentimes do is they would be in mid-battle with another tribe or another group, and then they would act like they were retreating and flee. And so the other tribe would be like, "Yay, we won," and celebrating. And the next thing you know, the Mongols would come back, and oftentimes they would bring the larger part of their force that they would initially fight with only a small amount of their troop, and then surprise, oh, guess what? You thought there was only 1,000 of us? Well, there's actually 10,000 of us. And that all the time would get these smaller tribes because they would kind of think, oh yeah, we're great, and we let our guard down, and the next thing you know, that boom, smacked without even realizing it. So that was one practice they were known for. Another would be to attack or ravage surrounding areas, and then they would allow for some to escape, especially like women and children would be these refugees, and the refugees would have nowhere to go, so they would run to oftentimes the larger cities and these surrounding areas. And when the larger cities would get this massive influx of people, it weakened their system and allowed for the Mongols to basically come in and boom, just hit them when they were kind of struggling with all of this influx of refugees. So that was another tactic that they used. Third, was very brutal one, using prisoners of war as human shields. So people that they would capture in battle, they would keep them around and basically use them as human shields. They would send them out as kind of the first wave of people into battle, and oftentimes just not concerned if they lived or died, or would use them to protect themselves. If they were, let's say, marching towards another group, they would just basically put them right in front of them. The Mongols were amazing riders. They were most frequently seen on horseback. There's a lot of images of them always on horseback. And so they used this tactic as well that really very much allowed for them to be successful. And then the last thing is that they spread terror to propagate this idea that they were this vicious, mean, brutal group. And they hoped that that would make people afraid of them. And it's very much kind of this idea of that the enemy you don't know, you can be very much afraid of this larger than life entity. And so people would fear them and run, and it made them weak and targets. And that was something that the Mongols would feed off of, this idea. They were frequently called the devil by many of those in the surrounding regions. So a lot of very brutal practices. However, in comparison, Genghis Khan also was practicing a lot of what we would consider enlightened or, forward-thinking policies, doing things like allowing for social mobility for the people that were his followers within the empire. So people being allowed to move up or down within the social system. So that was very important and forward-thinking. He promoted religious tolerance. Oftentimes people try and say that the Mongols were mostly Muslims. While some were Muslims, many of them did not have any specific religious affiliation and practiced, a variety of, more maybe pagan or polytheistic beliefs. So while some were Muslims, it wasn't like they were a part of the Muslim empire, which is a misconception that a lot of people try and lump them in with the Muslim empire. However, they did influence the Mughal dynasty, if you remember from our previous lesson in the Middle East unit. Third thing they did is abolish torture for those that were part of their society. Torture was not appropriate, and they generally would execute prisoners relatively quickly if need be. They encouraged trade, especially using the Silk Road and other entities that still existed. And one of the most significant things they did is they were the first to create an international postal system. They used different checkpoints that would serve as basically like little post offices, and mail and other messages would be able to be passed along all throughout the empire. So those types of things allowed for a lot of, great ideas, and many of the people that were a part of the Mongol Empire were relatively very happy and satisfied with Genghis Khan's rule. So Genghis Khan, one of the other major significant things that he did is the vast size of the empire that he was able to conquer. So we're going to talk about this more in a second, was going to be able to conquer China and the Song Dynasty. And from there, they would go on later to continue to invade in parts of modern-day Russia, as well as parts of kind of right up above India into other parts of modern-day China and Pakistan and Afghanistan, as well as into parts of the Middle East where Iran is, and Turkey and Iraq and that region. So what's significant about the Mongol Empire is that it is the largest continuous empire in world history. It was larger than the Roman Empire, and still to this day it's considered the largest continuous, meaning connected the entire way. And so vast, huge empire. However, it is rivaled by the largest non-continuous empire, which is, that's right, the British. Very good. All right, so how would this empire come to an end? At least the smaller part, and then later be extended further and turned into the Yuan dynasty. So basically, how this kind of transformation is going to occur is that Genghis Khan is going to die in 1227. They believe that he fell off his horse during battle. However, there have been other rumors and suspicions about how he possibly may have died that would be different than that idea, but most believe it was from falling off of his horse. Now, one of the most significant things about Genghis Khan and his death is that after he died, because he was considered so important and significant, they decided that they would bury him in a site where no one would ever be able to disturb him, so that he could rest in absolute peace. So what they did is they brought a funeral procession out, they buried him in an undisclosed location, and then on the way back to where they believed they were returning to, some of the soldiers began executing those that had helped bury Genghis Khan. And then the soldiers that executed the others committed suicide. So literally, there was no single person that was part of the funeral procession that made it out alive and knows where Genghis Khan is buried. So even today, this is still a major mystery, and people have tried to figure out where he could potentially be buried. So kind of one of the greatest history mysteries is, where is Genghis Khan buried? And so then after his death, his successors were going to overthrow the Song dynasty, and that was going to further expand and unify their empire. And so that's why they are significant within Chinese history, because this time period into the 1300s, the Mongol Empire is going to more or less transform into the Yuan dynasty, and the Yuan dynasty is going to be led by Genghis Khan's son, Kublai Khan, and he's going to rule China as their leader, and he's going to continue to further expand their empire and establish new cultural traditions, specifically in areas of like theater and literature and things like that. So we can see Genghis Khan's legacy influencing China during this time period and continuing to expand, as well as the fact that this is where China gets some of its larger land size that it still has today.